Okay, first of all, welcome to the special lecture organized by Ilmin International Relations Institute. The Ilmin Institute is celebrating 30th anniversary this year, and today's special lecture is the opening. It's the big opening of that celebratory event, and I'm thrilled. I'm delighted to have a very special lecturer today, Professor Kent Calder from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS. The Edwin O. Reischauer, the legendary the Japan specialist, and he's leading Reischauer Center. He has served also as interim dean and also the Vice Dean for Faculty Affairs and International Cooperation at the SAIS. But more than anything else, he actually doesn't need a lot of introduction, but he is a great scholar, and also whatever he writes, either and usually both, it becomes a bestseller and award-winning books, and recently he wrote about the Eurasian, the maritime geopolitics, and also Eurasian geopolitics supercontinent. So I definitely think he deserves the real big opening of this Ilmin commemoratory event. So please, today he will share his insight with KU faculties and students. And we have a great honor to host the Dean Han Jong-sun for a congratulatory remark on behalf of GSIS and DIS, and also as a great expert and scholar in Japanese studies. Professor Han Jong-sun will deliver the congratulatory remarks. So.
You must be very thrilled.
Yeah, I was too excited. Sorry for that.
No problem. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you to the 30th anniversary special lecture of the Ilmin International Relations Institute. The Ilmin International Relations Institute has long been at the forefront of intellectual inquiry dedicated to the advancing both regional and global peace. In this spirit, today's lecture by Professor Kent Calder is truly special. Professor Calder began his career as a specialist in Japanese trade and industrial policy, and has since expanded his research to examine China's growing influence and the dynamics of continental integration. His shift from the archipelago-focused perspective to one that embraces continental integration and beyond offers insights that are not only important, but also remarkably timely. I hope this lecture today sparks fresh thinking and new conversations about how we can navigate this pivotal moment for regional and global peace. Once again, welcome and thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean Han and Professor Lee, for those remarks. It's wonderful to see a group of old friends from, I wouldn't say old, but new friends from here at Korea University, and also a good friend from past years, Dr. Nielsen Wright as well. You might wonder from what was just said whether there's some coherence in what it is that I work on. I have done a good deal of work on comparative political economy, particularly, as it was said, industrial policy within Japan itself, but then increasingly interested in the broader implications both of that and the process of global transformation stimulated by changes in Japan and Northeast Asia that led me to an interest in political geography in various dimensions. We sometimes think that the world the physical world is more or less static, that places that on land or on sea are what they have always been and they'll always be that way. But recent history shows us the functional importance of places in the world, be they land or sea, is profoundly transformed by technology and often by politics. Needless to say, here on the Korean Peninsula, where the physical changes since 1900 have not been so substantial, but because of the way that politics has impinged on Korea, and most recently with changes in technology, both the land and the sea surrounding Korea, of course, have changed in tremendous ways. Before I really go into the subject of what I want to talk about substantively, which relates to what I just said, I'd like to, of course, congratulate Ilmin Institute on its 30th anniversary. What a extraordinary group of scholars, statesmen that you've had over the years. My first association, of course, was with your founding director, Professor Han Sung-ju, whom I deeply admired and knew well. The first meeting over at the Sheila Hotel, I remember, with Kim Ki-won. And then over the years, in his time here at Korea University, over in your old building, when he was director of the Ilmin Institute, then as ambassador to Washington, and in many other ways. Professor Kim Sung-han, I've always admired, and of course some of his students have been students of ours, Hyunji Rim, for example, as well. And most recently, but most intensively, I would say, Professor Lee Jae-sung, who with whom I've worked closely. We co-chaired a major conference on Eurasia's transformation. Hopefully there'll be a major, I'm sure there will be a major book coming from that. He stimulated a lot of my own thinking about the Eurasia's transformation, also about energy security, which has been another major concern. And I'm honored that we have also a MOU with the Ilmin Institute, and we've found ways to engage in a wonderful range of cooperations that I hope over time will also become more intense. We're also, the Reischauer Center for East Asian Studies that I head at SAIS is now in its 40th, about to celebrate its 40th anniversary, just as you're celebrating your 30th, and we hope to involve all of you in that as those proceedings go forward. We've done conferences together. I hope that we'll be able to do more. We've hosted some visitors, including students in Washington, and I hope that we can do more of that. And I do look forward also to perhaps introducing some students from our institute, many of whom have deep interests in Korea and in the theoretical issues that you deal with as well. So, and of course, we're honored to have Professor Lee associated with us as Senior Fellow of the Reischauer Center as well. Now, I think there's the things that I'm going to say just a few words today about the trilateral Korea, U.S., Japan relationship, how it's evolved from an era not so long ago when all that we had was what Victor Cha called a virtual alliance and hub and spokes relationships in Northeast Asia, into something which is significantly more than that. Today or yesterday, I was looking at the paper this morning, and Chris Landau, the Deputy Secretary, was just here in town. Yesterday, of course, is the 75th anniversary of the Incheon landings, which were a historic step in U.S.-Korea relations. I think there's no question. We're also today, actually, just beginning the Freedom Edge trilateral exercises among Korea, Japan, and the United States in the southern part of Korea here, dealing particularly with ballistic missile defense and maritime issues. So there are a range of dimensions along which Korea, U.S., Japan relations have been, in recent years, becoming closer. I'll go more into why that's the case later, maybe just leave a little bit of a puzzle out there, because I do think in many ways, of course, it's a puzzling reality. I was a student of Edwin Reischauer at Harvard University, but then worked with him in his very last years at Harvard, but of course heard many of the stories about his time as ambassador. I didn't know him at that time, but I know that he said frequently one of his proudest moments was having been involved in quietly furthering the Korea-Japan relationship during, which was normalized during his time as ambassador in 1965. I also realized, though, from looking at the history, that President Lee Myung-bak, who also was a graduate of Korea University, if I'm not mistaken, that he was one of the leaders of the opposition to that normalization. And I can easily understand how, given the past history, some of which will never be forgotten but needs to be managed, was a difficult thing all of the way around. So it's a very interesting puzzle as to how that relationship gradually emerged. Maybe, given that that's the case, I should, rather than just prolonging the suspense about that for so long, let me just say a word or two about how I think that seemed at the time that it occurred, of course, to be outside the realm of possibility, particularly here in Korea, how that happened after it actually was created signed in 1965, how it was normalized and how it became a more significant part of the broader relationship among the three countries. And my perspective on this is influenced partly because Mark Napper, whom some of you know, who served as the charge d'affaires, the acting ambassador here in Seoul during the late Trump and early Biden or Trump administrations, and it was head of the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Korea and Japan, was a student of mine at Princeton, and we've been close across the years. And also Tony Blinken, who was Secretary of State, was a visiting fellow at SAIS in 2017 and 18. So I remember vividly some of those early moments. And I think it all begins really with 2013, the Biden's visit to Tokyo, Seoul, under the Obama years of Vice President Biden. I remember Sung Kim was also talking a lot about that, whom we knew fairly well in those years. And Biden went first to Tokyo, and he understood that Prime Minister Abe was not going to visit the Yasukuni Shrine. And then Biden came here to Seoul and conveyed sort of his understandings of that situation in Korea. But then abruptly, Abe decided to visit Yasukuni Shrine. And it was clear that there was a real gulf between Seoul and Tokyo. And this was a concern. Blinken was deputy secretary at the time, and of course Biden was vice president. And this was a crisis in the Obama years, the latter half of the Obama years, that was really one of the top concerns of the administration. And for Secretary, later to be Secretary Blinken himself, one of the great satisfactions of his years as Deputy Secretary was that he felt that there was significant progress on that. And then, of course, when Biden came back to power in 2000, and Mark Napper, of course, believed in these sort of things as well. I think he helped to keep that notion relatively current during his time here in Seoul, although, of course, his main concerns were Korea-specific. And then when Biden came back, this was a very strong interest of then Secretary Blinken, with his fond memories of what had happened earlier. And Kurt Campbell, of course, who later became Deputy Secretary, also had a strong personal interest in this. And then, interestingly, President Trump, of course, he had the special interest in Korean issues from his first term, but from various people who, including some who work for the administration now. My sense, certainly one part of this is the war and peace issues. That's one dimension of it. But there are also, of course, people who dealt with both Korea issues and also with the interaction with Japan in the first Trump administration who are back. Steve Bacon is not there, but Kevin Kim, who is now a Deputy Assistant Secretary for both Korea and Japan, as I think you know, one of our former alumni at SAIS. But then the economic dimension, the capability of these two countries in the international system to do things that are considered, that President Trump considers valuable in making America great again, both investment issues, including relating to the pipeline in Alaska, where he's announced the interest of Korea and Japan in that regard, and in a range of other issues. So interestingly, we have a very unusual coincidence of opinion and interest between the Biden and Obama administrations, the Democratic administrations on the one hand, and then the two portions, Trump 1 and 1.0 and Trump 2.0, of the Republicans. So it's a very unusual case, and I think highlights the point that I would like to make next, which is that I think strategically this triangle is becoming increasingly important in world affairs. The first reason is the North Korean role in militarily in the world, the progress of North Korean nuclear programs, particularly the progress of North Korean missile programs, the undersea dimension, submarines, and the maritime dimension, about which I'll talk a little bit later. And very, very importantly, the new forms of assistance, particularly technological and economic, that Russia is providing to North Korea in return, partly, of course, for the aggressive presence, supportive presence, maybe is the best way to put it, by the North Korea in Ukraine itself. And then in Kursk, where the North Korean troops, of course, played a key role in pushing the Ukrainians out of the significant advances that they had made there. So the North Korean dimension, and related to that, of course, the deepening relationship between China and Russia in various dimensions, beginning right after or during the time of the Beijing Winter Olympics, which immediately, of course, preceded Putin's attack on Ukraine. So we're in a very different world in terms of those geopolitical dynamics, both in Northeast Asia, centering on North Korea, and also more broadly, of course, across the Eurasian continent. Of course, those have given a new importance to the global role of Korea, particularly within the Eurasian context, the role of Korea in relation to the frontline states. In the conference that we did under our joint project, I thought Professor Lee spoke quite eloquently and very well received, both in Germany but also in Romania, to the AC4 concept, the idea that Korea and Japan should reach across the continent, should be involved in deeper relationships with NATO. Of course, there was also a very strong interest in Korea's defense industry, defense industrial base, and what that meant for the frontline states. And so the Ukraine war, along a whole range of dimensions, both in deepening the Russian relationships with North Korea, and enhancing North Korea's capabilities, and also in altering the geopolitics among the frontline states of NATO in Europe, has changed the situation, created a need and of course new opportunities for Korea, and Japan under Prime Minister Kishida moved along a very similar sort of line and created a new sort of situation. Finally, I should add the technological factors, particularly in cyber security. The Russians because partly just in an attempt to disrupt these deepening relationships among the democracies, have also been implying new hybrid strategies, some of these undersea related, some of them also in the realm of cyber. And cyber, particularly in that it is a realm that doesn't involve geography directly, is a natural area for cooperation between NATO in Europe and the AC4 countries, including particularly Korea and Japan in Asia. So this triangle operates. The one last thing that I would want to stress is the defense industrial complex. There's, of course, the shipbuilding dimension that we see in the newspapers. I did, my latest book has quite a bit to do with that, particularly in the shipbuilding dimension. Of course, the Philadelphia shipyard, it was the first naval shipyard in the United States. It's now been acquired by a Korean firm and is working on the idea of icebreaker construction, which is very much supported by the Trump administration. And of course, the United States is both intent on domestic production in the United States, and but that is in its way not, except for some very specialized areas, an area where the United States is very competitive, just because in basic industry the U.S. over the years, its capabilities, not only in shipbuilding, but in steel, in shipping. Many of the related industries have unfortunately declined. So in thinking about that issue, to me, it's interesting and important analytically to go beyond simply the question of who's going to build ships. It probably will be a while before the United States will subcontract aircraft carriers or even frigates and so on in their entirety to Korea or Japan or something like that. I don't think that is really the area that we're talking about. But some kind of hybrid cooperation that involves important areas of the supply chains. Now, many of that hybrid cooperation has already gone quite a distance between Japan and the United States in areas like Tomahawk missile production or, cruise missile production and that sort of thing, involving production of components inside the United States and then assembly within the U.S. But some of those supply chain dynamics that have already developed, as I said, particularly between Japan and the U.S., I should suppose could well be relevant both to bilateral cooperation between Korea and the United States and also potentially to broader trilateral cooperation, because there are also important areas. If we take, for example, carbon fiber, Sozai Zangyo, the advanced materials industries, or cryogenics, the cold water technology, a low temperature technology. Japan's very strong, for example, in LNG carriers. There are areas where Japanese capabilities and Korean capabilities and U.S. capabilities, actually all of them, are potentially synergistic. I think it's fair to say. And my guess would be that that's more true than in the aerospace area, many of areas where the United States, of course, is particularly strong, or on the land defense industrial, the land-based areas where, of course, Korea particularly is strong. So again, defense technology is something I think where one should think about the importance of that. Now, you might just ask, if we have this history, long history of bitterness going back to 1965 and all of the difficulties of rationalizing that relationship and dealing with the very understandable historical issues and so on that existed, how feasible politically is it? Even if it's strategically rational, how feasible is it politically to think about collaboration among these three countries? Well, I can speak best to the U.S. side of this. And I do think that probably at least from the Obama years, as I said earlier, the United States has felt a strong belief that strategically speaking, given the rise of China, given the deepening ties of Russia and China, and then the growing capabilities of China, particularly, that there was a logic to this trilateral cooperation. But of course, for many years, history served as such an important barrier to this. From the U.S. side, first of all, I think we have, ever since Obama, we've had a continuity in that and a desire from the American side to try its best to help to build bridges between Korea and Japan without trying to become like a mediator or a referee or anything like that. To be a third party, but a concerned third party that saw the rising security issues that existed and trying to build more bridges. So we've got a very unusual continuity. I don't think on the Ukraine that you have this continuity. You don't have this continuity on the Middle East. But very interestingly and importantly, you do on Korea, U.S.-Japan relations, a belief that comes from President Obama, President Biden, and President Trump, all of whom have seen and I think continue to see the importance strategically of this triangle. Very recently, of course, President Trump had successful summits both with Prime Minister Ishiba, but also with President Lee, and those went well. Of course, the others, President Biden had very successful trilateral summit. As many of you know, at Camp David, it was a very unusual meeting of the three, President Yoon and Prime Minister Kishida and President Biden. And so at very high levels, in very unusual ways, this is, from the U.S. side at least, the U.S. has become a strong supporter for this. It's becoming increasingly institutionalized. The annual summits, or even more often, side meetings at major multilateral meetings like the G7 or the G20 have also become much more common. We have, even at SAIS, a program. Kirk Campbell played a key role in doing this when he was Deputy Secretary, for bringing researchers with specialists on technology together from the three countries at SAIS for an executive ed program. So there's, at various levels, I think, deepening relations, and here inside Korea, also with President Yoon having pioneered deepening ties in many ways, and then President Lee also being supportive, and in Japan as well. The fact that President Lee, as his first overseas visit, that he visited Japan, I think was very, very positively regarded by Prime Minister Ishiba and by Washington as well. Now, so a deepening triangle which strategically makes sense. Now, is everything peaceful, and is this just going to continue to be a major factor? Well, of course, history is hard to overcome, and needless to say, in Korea, given the very real struggles and sufferings that Korea's had in the past. I'm not one to speak to that, but I am conscious of having an interest in history and having spent time in Korea also in those issues. There's an LDP presidential election, I think it looks like October 4th or so. One of the candidates has frequently visited Yasukuni Shrine. Some good possibility that, and she's actually the leader in that competition now. The possibility that there might be a Yasukuni Shrine visit, I think, is not so far beyond the realm of possibility. So that, history still, of course, remains a challenge. Contradictions in U.S. policy, I think, and this is stepping outside of the security realm more toward the economy, but I think we're all very conscious of what happened down in Georgia last week. And I think there's something to be said about that. The United States wants foreign investment, clearly, and at the summit between President Lee and President Trump, of course, there was a discussion of that and major commitments. But then, I don't know, several hundred people who were arrested out of, I guess, subsidiaries of Lucky Gold Star particularly. B1 visa holders, I understand, something like that. And the interesting thing that struck me, which suggests a need when we talk about challenges for a new policy approach, is the fact that Korea has less visas. I think one of Jungyang Ilbo, if I'm not mistaken, this morning was talking about this matter, has less work visas in the United States than Singapore does, even though, of course, Korea's population is massively, 10 times maybe, or so, even if you include guest workers in the figure for Singapore, massively larger. I think what it suggests is, and I'm reflecting on this for the United States, we need to think about investment in a holistic sense. We need to think about what conditions are needed to really encourage investment, not just to say, twist people's arms and say, you've got to invest, or else we'll kill you, or we'll put 100% tariffs on you, or something like that. And in this case, the relevant question is, and I hope that our two countries, and there may be relevance for Japan as well, will think about the visa issues in relationship to the investment issues. Think holistically about the whole notion of, quote, making America great again. I do think the Trump administration, and there certainly is a positive, from speaking as an American, some positive dimension to this. I don't think it's only xenophobia, but the United States needs a stronger manufacturing base. And I think probably the majority of Americans would agree on that. They don't necessarily agree on the details of tariffs, or certainly not arbitrary arrests and so on. They do agree, and I think many of our partners, especially our allies around the world, believe the United States needs a stronger manufacturing base if we're to be credible, and particularly in the defense industrial side. But not only that, more generally speaking, we need a stronger industrial base. And the old patterns of simply relying on all of our manufacturers on imports, and rather than production at home, I think that era may very well be fading as a possibility. But that said, we need to think about this holistically. We need to think about ways that we can get the understanding of our partners, and to have more serious policy dialogues with them. So those contradictions are certainly there. Divergent China policies are certainly there. The shadow of history across the triangular, the Korea, U.S., Japan relationship. We were just talking a few minutes ago, even on Ukraine, for example, there are different views because Korea has had a different experience with Russia than Japan has. There's the era of Queen Min and the fight against Japanese aggression before 1905, a positive heritage there. And in the Japanese case, there's battle with with Russia in 1904. So even if we go back a century and more, the Japanese and the Korean relationship with Russia is rather different. And so there's going to be differences there. There's going to be differences on China, no doubt. And I think we do have to be sensitive. Now, finally, in conclusion, I guess I'd like to repeat what I said earlier about this very unusual combination of community of perspective between Obama, Biden on the one hand, and Trump on the other, in support of Korea, U.S., Japan relations. I think this is something very important to build on. And then, of course, the changes that have occurred here in Korea, President Yoon and President Lee being along a similar line, or in Japan, Prime Minister Kishida, Prime Minister Ishiba, and I think future leaders, maybe apart from one or two, but a coincidence of political interests. So what do we need to do? I think reinforcing institutions that were created under Biden, like the Trilateral Summit, is one. Exercises like Freedom Edge that's going on right now among the three of them that deepen the operational capabilities together. Real-time defense coordination, information sharing, GSOMIA agreement that allows for real-time monitoring, for example, of missile launches. It could very well be that North Korea will attack Japan first, and at least Korea will be able to monitor that and to help with whatever response is needed. Cultivating new areas of opportunity, maritime, aerospace, defense industrial base, and even in investment. A holistic approach to investment in immigration areas, which I think was so clearly lacking in the U.S. response to what happened in Georgia just a couple of weeks ago. So I could say more. I've worked recently on the maritime relationship. I could say more about cooperation that the three countries could do in that area, but in the interest of time, I really would like to hear from everyone. Let me just say, I do think that because of this rising strategic importance and deepening and changing political dynamics, we're entering a new era of interdependence among these three countries, driven by technology and geopolitics. And we need to think about how it's very fragile. It may be a new era of interdependence, but it's also fragile. And so to think together about how we can stabilize that is a major issue. And in conclusion, I should say, given its history, I think the Ilman Institute would be a natural place for that kind of very important discussion to go on. So thank you very much. It's an honor to be back here, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you. I'm saying that.